On Friday, the most prominent journalist of Central America was captured by the Guatemalan government, setting a turning point on the country's young democracy. But for us to understand why this happened, we need to go back to analyze the most complex and sophisticated rule of law experiment in a Latin American country that at least my eyes have ever seen. So this experiment began actually at the early 90s, once Guatemala was transitioning to be an electoral democracy in a context where a 30-year-old civil war was going to an end. During those 30 years, the civil war was going on. The military actually took a lot of power, sufficient power to control every single institution in the government, leaving a little bit of room margin for civil, newly elected authorities. So this control by the military actually was divided into big parts. The institutional military that controlled most part of the government institutions, and one parallel group of military and former military. These groups acting together established a huge, really big criminal network in the country. This criminal network operated in every single stage of government. They controlled the finance institutions, they controlled the courts, they control borders, and they were actively part of organized crime in the country and in the region. So at this point, once the military have control and Guatemala is transitioning to a democracy and civil governments are being elected, these activities were getting more and more clandestine. So as these activities were getting more clandestine, these criminal groups were actually consolidating. So by the early 1990s, once Guatemala was finishing its civil war and the peace accords were signed, military and army was reduced actually by a third of its size, which meant that a lot of soldiers and military were out of job, and they actually joined more and more criminal networks. So a group of civil society leaders start having talks with the UN directly, and the UN actually suggested for Guatemala to implement some sort of institution or commission that will help the Attorney General's office to control these criminal groups. After maybe 6 or 7 years of negotiation, the Guatemalan government and the UN finally signed this accord, which is particularly different from all of your corruption, anti-corruption, and transparency institutions, because this accord actually permitted the UN to elect its commissioner. And the counterpart was the Guatemalan president was entitled to renew the commission's mandate every 2 years. So you have this cross-control power, right? Which actually became what brought the commission to an end. So the commission was implemented in 2006. During a period of 9 years, violent murders were reduced by 32%. Something like 320 criminal organizations were dismantled. 680 people were actually prosecuted. Half of them are in jail right now. So it was going very well, right? The Guatemalan people were excited. And in 2015, the commission prosecuted the president, Otto Perez Molina, and its vice president. They were forced to resign during a storm of civil protest, and they were both put in jail. So between this extremely complex political storm that had the Guatemalan people rising, the 2015 elections became the turning point for everything. We needed a good president that was able to consolidate this institutional exercise or experiment of the rule of law. Everything was going to be decided in that election. So ironically, the Guatemalan people elected an ex-TV comedian who actually used to do blackface on national television and was an extremely conservative evangelic. And was not even a college graduate. So the election of that president was maybe the second turning point that changed everything. Even though President Morales, the president I'm talking about, originally was in favor of the continuity of the commission, a couple of years after, his son was prosecuted for money laundering. And by 2018, 5 members of the economical elites, 5 prominent businessmen, were prosecuted by the commission for giving $1 million in illegal campaign financing to President Morales. This made President Morales reject the commission. His first act was he illegally expelled the commissioner. He went on national television saying that the commissioner needed to leave the next day. The reaction of the Attorney General's office, request to retire immunity from President Morales. His reaction, expelling the commission. So once the commission left, and President Morales destroyed this hope that the Guatemalan people have on restoring the rule of law using this powerful institution that had put 320 people in jail, all the hope was gone. So the question I'm asking that is useful for all of us is what happens when you try to impose radically and rapidly an experiment, an exercise that is going to change the way the country understands the rule of law. In Guatemala, the answer is that today, a couple of years after the commission has left, our political leaders are actually destroying what's left of our young electoral democracy. So the reaction was in a context where we have no rule of law, where civil elected officers have little control over its institutions, where electoral democracy is young or almost doesn't exist. The politicians in charge today are actually prosecuting and putting in jail most of the judges, of the prosecutors, journalists, and everybody else. So the lesson is this extremely radical and rapid exercise of the rule of law actually created the biggest democratic backlash in Guatemala in the last 30 years. So our big lesson is that there are no shortcuts to the rule of law. The only way to impulse the rule of law in a country is when a lot of political actors get together to work to institutionalize the rule of law through the years in a collective decision in which all of us are involved. And actually, leaders matter. If Guatemala had elected a different president in 2015, everything would have been different. So leaders matter, and there are no shortcuts to the rule of law. Thank you all.